Hello and welcome to Aceto Magazine. This video is going to be a little bit different. As you can see, I brought my whiteboard with me because I also want to illustrate certain things, and the topic of today are the different modes of governance. The modes of governance play an important part within politics and political science, and this is, at least I hope, to be a bit more stringent on that, one of the first videos on political education where we dive into certain concepts and also dismantle certain terms and phrases that we use in our everyday lives. The reason for that is that political education is a particularly not only interesting but more so important aspect of our daily lives. Whenever we talk about politics, we might not really reflect on what terms we are using, how we are using it, and the emotions and thoughts that we are combining or connecting to those concepts. For example, fairness, justice, democracy are all concepts that we might use in political discussions, as well as undemocratic, illegitimate, or, for example, even simple and often used terms such as war and peace. When we are using these things without knowing the background and the structural and linguistic depths of those concepts, we are basically reflecting the information that other people told us, and with other people we often, and this is something that seems to be obvious in this context, what media and news outlets basically trying to convey. There is an informational discrepancy because they know the terms better and they are able to kind of shape linguistic agendas around those terms and connect them with certain emotions that you might feel. You understand the terms in the way they want it, and you carry those messages subconsciously to the world. And then we have the consolidation of certain terms that are used wrongfully, and the ideas about certain political concepts are not going to be in the proper way. This leads us to ill policy making, because the public discourse is kind of moving away from the technicalities and the true ideas that lay behind those concepts. So it's a bit complex, and to summarize it or make it a bit shorter, the reason why I think political education needs to be more present and why we need to develop ourselves in that realm is that we can dismantle the information that we encounter on a daily basis, be more developed in the handling and more experienced in the handling of political information, makes more sound adjustments, and with that we're basically shaping the discourse that we're having in our daily lives. In the end, this leads to a situation where we make more sound voting decisions, become more educated and conscious political people, so we really build up our political character and political persona based on true knowledge and not what concepts that are loaded with different kind of normative connotations were brought to us. So in this video, as I said, I'm going to talk about the modes of governance. Let me quickly write that down. Modes of governance. And what we mean by that is that we hear, oops, apparently that's not working quite well. And what we mean by that is basically, how can politics be shaped? Maybe I just come to this side, right? How can we basically govern systems? There are three modes. The first one is that one person rules the system, the one person rule. This is commonly known, and I might have to switch pens here already. The one person rule is commonly known as a monarchy. And there we have it. In the introduction I said there are certain terms that are loaded with connotations and meaning, and when we read monarchy and the contemporary political climate and landscape, we tend to associate negative emotions with that, right? And by doing so, we're forgetting that this is actually a technical term for the one-person rule. The monarchy is based on the idea that one person is the sovereign and is dealing in the best interest of the nation. But this is not the only way a society can be governed. We then have the few people rule. There are different kind of descriptions. We can also say elite rule, but this is not meant in a negative way. There is a small group who governs, of people who govern basically the society, and what we commonly call those systems is aristocracy. Famously named after the person who basically found this categorization or first coined these terms, Aristotle. And he carries has the honor to be called by one of those systems. What do we mean by that? There's a small circle of people who basically make the rules. It is not just one person, might be two. I mean, the Roman Empire under the consul system, where they had like the two-headed rule, is a suitable example there. But it can also be something a bit more, up to 20 people or maybe 50 people, maybe even 100 people. So just a few people that come together in maybe a council or something like that and make the rules. Then we have another system that is the system where the whole society rules, and we call this system, like the participatory system where the whole society is involved, a polity. And in a polity, the idea is that the power and the sovereignty is dispersed. The ruling power is basically distributed to the members of the society, meaning that they all have a say. Polity is also leaning on the old Greek systems, where they basically were gathering, and the whole population of a certain city-state, which, by the way, were called polities, make decisions together. And this is also the main term for politics later on, because it's like a joint governing system. But what we can also say about, for example, old Turkic nations and societies is that they were kind of a mix of all three. We had monarchs like, for example, Motun, in Turkish known as Metehan, of the First Hunnic Empire. He was a monarch, but he also had a very strong council around him, and without the unanimous decision of a council, no political measures could be taken. And on the other side, the legitimacy was also asked from the people. So it's kind of a mix of all three. In the end, it still should count as a monarchy, but there were also aristocratic elements and polity elements in there as well. You might argue that there is a fourth option, and this is no rule, or nobody rule. Nobody rule. And this is what we call anarchy. The problem with anarchy is that this is unrealistic. What proponents of these or defendants of this system basically say is that they don't want to be subject to any kind of rule, they want to rule themselves. But the problem is, biologically, anarchy is not possible. In an anarchic system, we need to still gather food also need to have access to water. Within the population of everyone wanting to go to the same water sources as well as same food sources, there is a heightened competition. And depending on where we live, people develop different tactics to gather food secure access to water. And because that is the case, we are in a constant state of survival, because we always need to find the next food or water source and also try to defend it. So our whole being is basically structured around surviving and competing against one another. The big advantage of governing groups of people, namely societies, is that when we outsource the idea of securing the survival, all other members of the society, no matter how small or big it is, they can concentrate on further developing the society. And therefore, having no rule basically is a very difficult situation to sustain, and would basically not bring us into the state of development that we can kind of make use of our cognitive potential. So technically it might work if we kind of abandon the idea that we are developing as people, and basically having cameras and whiteboards and bookshelves and so on and so forth, but rather just live to eat, drink, and then constantly defend ourselves. So in these situations, we outsource the task of securing the survival of a larger group, and therefore we transfer power to them. And because no transfer of power is here, we have full power over ourselves, but we are also fully responsible for surviving on ourselves. Now, therefore, we just discredit it as a viable political system, because this is something that is not going to work. And even if a society is going to say that they are not going to rule one another and are going to be anarchic, another society is going to come and kind of conquer the other society. Now, Aristotle had those, found those different categorizations. For me, I think it's a bit exaggerated to make a big deal out of it. I mean, he was just the first to identify it. There are just these three types of governance. But what is interesting and what I think is valuable about this categorization is that these are the good forms, right? So he identified it and said, okay, well, if we have these systems, the good form is called in one of these three, or can be summarized in one of the three terms. What do I mean, or what does he mean with the good form? It means that when the system of monarchy is running, we call it a monarchy when the monarch is acting in the interest of its society. Same holds true for the aristocracy and for the polity. So whenever these three systems function in the interest of society, meaning development and knowledge production and so on and so forth, peace, justice, and all those things that that we basically want to structure our lives around and to fill our lives with, these are the good forms. But he also said this is not always the case, because, and this is where the connotation comes from, the monarch might not always work in the best interest of the society. And when that happens, he is pursuing personal interest, and when we talk about the aristocracy, they are pursuing group interests. And when that happens, we are not calling, or we're not talking about a monarchy anymore, we're talking about a tyranny. Meaning that if a monarch is going to enrich himself from the powers that were transferred to him by the society, or he took it from the society, we call it a tyranny. And whenever that happens, we also have developmental inefficiencies, because the resources are not used effectively to further the cause of society, whatever that might be. This is something that I'm going to talk, that I talked already about in other videos, and especially in my book. You can see it here, DEVLET. It's a different approach to how states structure their purpose and their goals, but that's once again a topic for another day. So, when we talk about the tyranny, the personal interests are in focus, and here, and I'm very sure you heard about this term as well, when a small group does it, we call it an oligarchy. So here we talk about a small elitist group that is using the powers and seek personal or their group's interests, you know, their rent-seeking actors within that system. So this is also an inefficient system, and this is basically the perverted form of the aristocracy that is meant to pursue societal interests. Very interesting when we see it in how these things are normatively split. And this is also where basically everything else in politics that we encounter in everyday life happens. These are the most technical terms that we can think of, because they're the most fundamental distinctions between the different rules. And there's actually no normativity tied to them. At least there shouldn't be, because still, when we think about those terms, we have some sort of an idea where these things are going. But in strictly technical terms, right, they just delimit who is ruling, or how many people are ruling a nation. Here the normativity begins, and this is where we start to load things with more meaning, if not already done here. So we have the tyranny, we have the oligarchy, and then we continue to see a very familiar word, namely democracy. Democracy is the political system or the idea that we apply today. But originally, this is basically the perverted form of the polity. And it makes much sense when we compare it with systems that we have today. How can a society not act in its own interest? And that is a very tricky question. Here we can understand it. It enriches one person. Here, the perverted form of the aristocracy enriches few people. But what happens here? If the whole society is ruling the nation, how can they not act in the interests of the whole society? That is a very interesting question, and I think this is the main flaw that many democratic systems have nowadays. The difference is that when we make voting decisions and when we are engaging with politics, the idea is that our driving mechanism, or the motivational factor of our behavior here, is something that is detached from our own person. So this is again, and I'm again referencing my own book here, because here the idea is that it is not about the material or comfort gains or power gains that a society makes, but rather it is something more tied to the self-fulfillment dimension of our being, just to touch upon it superficially. But within the perverted form of the polity, even within the system, the democratic system, people make decisions based on their certain affiliations and groups. So they look what's best for them. And once they think about what's best for them, different interest groups emerge within society. For example, there are people who say, I'm very capable, I'm better than the others, I want to compete with them, and I want to have this society that I live in as competitive as possible. These are people on the right. They favor competition, they favor, what do they favor else? I mean, it is a non-redistributive system, so they like individualism, and they like, as we can see on the right, all the rightist movements, social homogeneity. Here we can see that when we have right-leaning parties, that they, within the perverted form of the polity, namely the democracy, are defending the interest of one group. So within that system, this emerges, interest groups, right? So we have oligarchic structures within democracies because rightist groupings are basically defending the interests of those people who think alike. And that also means, because they are grouping in political parties, they develop an organizational interest, and once they do that, they identify everything they associate with politics via this stream. The problem with that is that politics is so multifaceted and multi-layered that you cannot just go about and say, well, this is the ideology that I have, and everything that we do needs to be done in accordance with those principles. There are a few more, but just to get the general idea. And then on the other side of democracies, we have the leftist movements. We have the left. That is the exact opposite. It is redistributive, meaning that they do not want to have the competition. They are people on the losing side of the system, meaning they have less material means, less capital. They are maybe not as disciplined, not as hardworking. They might be less inclined to academic achievement and to cognitive development, innovation, and furthering, kind of the technical realm, meaning that they have a competitive disadvantage towards other people within the system, so they favor a system where everyone is picked up, right? So the incentive, basically, to be disciplined and to add to society is gone on the very extreme side of the left. On the right, kind of the human component, right? We said individualism here, the collectivist idea of being together, is getting lost. This is why rightist movements also favor social homogeneity, because in the end they want to be among themselves, they don't want any foreigners, and so on and so forth. It's therefore here rather collectivist, and we can see this also in, for example, Latin American countries, which are very collectivist, family and values that tie people together in friendships are much more important, for example, there. And the leftist culture is also very strong within those nations. And when we compare the most rightist countries, they're more individualistic. Great Britain and Europe, I say, Germany and France, like the European main actors, basically, are individualistic nations. So the rightist side, weighs a bit more heavy there. And because it's redistributive and collectivist, it is also culturally I would say diverse without without loading too much meaning to it, because here, whereas we have here a very strong cultural orientation to stick to certain values and to a certain social grouping, these things are broken basically in the leftist system. So notions like nationalism and national identity are basically, they're not home on this side of democracy. But what unites those two sides is that parties on the left spectrum of a democracy and on the right spectrum, they both have their own organizational interests, and because they pursue those interests of those groups, the democracy needs to be seen as kind of a perverted form of the whole society rule, meaning they are not acting in the interest of what is good for all, but only what is good for them in their own situation. And what unites them as well is that they have in between themselves a certain struggle that is based on who has the higher social status. Usually, as I said before, on the left, people have less means and they're not as competitive, right, personally. And because that is the case, they are losing in the direct comparison within capitalist systems, and that is very important to say as well. Within capitalist systems, where technological advancements and economic success are very important, the left is on the losing side. And therefore they want to redistribute and be more collectivist in order to reduce the discrepancy to the right. And because they are rather technical in thinking, the right, they have the advantage in capitalist systems. And this is another modification that we need to talk about, that we're going to talk about in a bit. But this is only valid within the capitalist system. This is not a universal rule. Because if that would be a universal rule, we would say that people with leftist thinking are generally under-equipped to compete and are kind of subject to natural selection thoughts. But coming back to the political systems and the mode of governance, what I want to explain here is that we have the axis of who rules and how they rule. So we can easily make a table out of this, and then we can say who rules, right? And then how do they rule? So these are basically our two dimensions, how we can split those things up. It is important to understand when we have a political system that we can categorize the main form correctly. For example, the United States of America are commonly described as a democracy. But if we dismantle the whole system, we would see that we're talking about an oligarchy. Because the left and right within the United States are so close together that there's actually no big difference in technical terms. This is something for later and in more in-depth analysis, but basically this is an oligarchic system. Then, for example, we have Oman, which is a one-person rule basically, but is more leaning towards monarchy. And we had in history some very generous and very talented monarchs. Yeah? North Korea, for example, is a classical tyranny. And we can also think about China being more on this side than this side, because currently the power of the incumbent president is getting more and more. We can also think about Israel as an aristocratic system. Interestingly, I pointed to oligarchy, but actually Israel can be seen as an aristocracy. Why? Because the impact of the prime minister of the nation was not that much. It is a very homogeneous society, and decisions are basically taken with little friction and discrepancy until lately, but I'm talking in general terms. It can be categorized in an aristocracy. This, paradoxically, does not mean that Israel cannot enter into war or force diasporas in Palestine. This is the foreign policy. But because that is in the interest of the Israeli nation, in the context of the goals that they set for themselves, we need to categorize this nation as an aristocracy. It does not mean that it is good. It does not mean that the system or the political actions taken are good and that we need to defend them. The opposite is the case. But because they set a certain goal for their society and the society supports this goal and the government is using the mode of governance to achieve that, we need to say that this is an aristocracy. With polity, I have a bit of a problem. Basically, this is maybe the best system there is. And DEVLETist systems, as I explain here in my book, are mostly on this side. So a DEVLETist system can also be a monarchy and aristocracy. But the polity has the big advantage that when the whole society rules and does it in the interest of the whole society, we have the least amount of risk, of political risk that we can have, because the power and sovereignty is dispersed and basically distributed to the whole society. All right, so these are the different forms, and I just want to quickly, how can I fit this in? I'm probably going to do it here. We have those systems, and in the next step we can modify them. Meaning, we can make autocratic democracies, parliamentary democracies. We can then make, for example, also democratic monarchies, because if you legally elect your monarch, it's still a monarchy, but it's still a democratic system, right? Just with extensive power. So this is kind of a mix of those things, even though democratic as an adjective has a whole different meaning than a subject. Here we're talking about the perverted form of the polity, and democratic itself just means it's a participatory system. But maybe just to make it a bit clearer and also make the distinction a bit more sensible in this case, we can name it participatory monarchy, and then the list goes on and on. So we can modify those systems, because different systems or systems with the same name or with the same fundamentals do not need to be the same. So for example, we can also add social democracy, as we see, for example, in Germany or generally in Europe, where this system is basically used. So the system there is fundamentally different than, for example, let's say Brazil, Japan, or South Africa. We can modify those systems, but the idea is that when we talk about those kind of terms, that when we encounter those terms in the media, in news, or whatever what kind of sources and platforms we're consuming, then we can identify, okay, well, we are talking about a certain system and not the values attached to that, right? And we need to delimit, okay, well, when we look in depth at the United States, we can identify it as a system that is actually not working in the interest of its people. So, after having the fundamentals here, as I said, the different systems can be also described in different ways according to their particularities. There is also another dimension that needs to be said and that affects the functioning of those systems are the economic systems. As I said, this struggle basically and the disadvantage of the left towards the right is present and very prominent in capitalist systems, but it doesn't mean that it is that way in other economic settings as well. We have, for example, state-planned economies, then there are state capitalist economies, there are just minor differentiations by saying illiberal economies where the state is a bit more restrictive, for example in China. This is also altering how those systems basically serve the group interest. For example, when we talk about Russia, an oligarchic system where the rents are basically flowing towards a certain group, and this is done through state-led measures. So we have a more state capitalist outset there, where the state is using its power within that oligarchic elite to channel funds into the interest group. A very different approach to oligarchic policymaking is again the United States, because those interest groups, they are very rich and funds are also channeled to those groups, but not through direct action by the state, but rather through market mechanisms. So we have the market-oriented capitalist system there that is basically altering the rules or setting the rules in certain ways, or implementing certain competitive measures so the interest groups can benefit from that. So there are different dimensions to it, and the way I see it, and I just want to illustrate it in a small map basically. At the core we have those modes of governance. Right? And from there, as I said, this is basically the most technical core that we have, and everything else is loaded with much or with many other connotations. From there, this is the neutral basis that we have. From there, we need to think about different contexts. As I said, interests. Which interests are served? Economic context. And my handwriting is awful, I'm sorry. And then, the mode of governance is also heavily dependent on culture. Collectivist, individualist, but there's lots more to it. You know, how do people interact with that culture? How homogeneous is it? Do we have language barriers? But also the modes of governance or the culture is also influenced by the environment, right? So how does that shape conduct and, for example, the natural resources they have? Then, and this is somewhat tied to culture as well, is the history. So with history, and this is some kind of a dependent variable that influences the mode of governance. When you, for example, apply for a job, what do the recruiters look at your experience. The experience tells how well you know things, how to run things. If you're very experienced, they know you come into this new company and from day one you start performing. And the same goes with history. If a nation has a history, of statecraft, the mode of governance is also adapting to that. It assumes different forms and it becomes more efficient. So these are the contexts that are very very important. But with that, with the cultural aspect, foreign relations are also influenced. If you're a nation that is very connected or very close to different cultures, you have a different starting point for your foreign policy than more isolated nation. Then obviously mode of governance is also influenced by resources, and then we can think about the Gulf nations. The Gulf nations are classical rentier states. This is what we call them, meaning they are not dependent on tax income. Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, for example, they are not dependent on tax income because the state is earning from the natural resources, predominantly oil. And because that is the case, the mode of representation is not given. Here in the other systems, like for example in a democracy and polity, when the power is transferred, at the very least there is the idea or kind of the indirect pressure to represent the people, but this is not the case in those rentier states because they're not paying any money to them, right? They have the power, obviously on paper they need to represent the people, but there are no accountability arrangements. So resources also influence the mode of governance. As we can see, the factors are they're not equal, and they do not have the same weight on the different modes of governance, and this also changes from nation to nation. For example, history and foreign relations are dependent on culture. Culture in turn is somewhat dependent on resources and the environment, and so on and so forth. Economic context is also kind of connected to the resources, but these are more or less the dimensions from which influence those factors, and the mode of governance is influenced by those factors in turn, so there's an interaction. All of these things I'm going to talk at a later point. I hope that you liked this video and I could enlighten you in some of the fundamentals of politics. I think this is one of the most important things to know and to differentiate, and I hope that you can reflect on those kind of things, and maybe at some point later when you encounter other news, use that knowledge and also in different discussions to say, well, actually these are the dimensions that we use to categorize it, and in that case it is displayed in a certain way, but the truth is that it is completely different. So if you like this video, I would appreciate you sharing it or maybe reacting to it if you have any questions that I'm happy to answer. And other than that, I hope to have you back for another video on political education by Cedar Magazine. More interesting content and articles you can find on scedar.com. I enjoyed it a lot, and thank you for tuning in, and until next time, bye.